Sandra stood in stunned silence. Her chest tightened and her mind raced. The words that Jessica had just hurled at her were like daggers. "I don't like anything about you, Mother. We want to live alone. Get out." It was like history repeating itself. She had been cast aside once before by her own parents. Now her son's wife was doing the same. The old house, where she had lived for decades, echoed with memories of a life that seemed too far gone now. But no matter how hard the situation seemed, Sandra was no stranger to pain. She clenched her fists. "Well, I'll leave then," she said, her voice steely. "But I won't forget this." Sandra Clark was no stranger to hardship, yet her life had been a series of fortunate events. At 61, she was still working, though her office was now just a few steps away from her living room. Gone were the days of commuting, of rushing to meetings in a suit and heels. Now, most meetings were virtual, allowing Sandra the flexibility to enjoy her work in the comfort of her home. Despite the conveniences of her lifestyle, Sandra often felt lonely in her son's house. The large property, once bustling with life, now seemed empty. It wasn't just the physical space that felt isolating, but the emotional distance between her and Jessica. Since the death of her husband, Sandra had always prided herself on her independence. But now, she had found herself relying on her son's generosity and his wife's intolerance. Sandra couldn't forget the first time she laid eyes on Jessica. It wasn't just the track suit that caught her off guard. It was the audacity. A young woman, trying to impress a mother-in-law with no effort, no decorum. When Jessica first arrived to announce her engagement, she proudly declared she wanted Sandra to see her without any pretense. To Sandra, it seemed like a childish gesture, completely out of touch with the formality that such a meeting demanded. Jessica had a sharp tongue, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Her arguments always seemed so well thought out, her words so perfectly chosen, that Sandra found herself at a loss in every exchange. What was supposed to be a simple conversation would spiral into a full-blown debate. Though Jessica's behavior was far from pleasant, Sandra couldn't deny one thing. She was beautiful. Yet, beauty alone could never make up for the lack of respect. Sandra sat down, her mind turning. She had endured this long enough. She wasn't going to let her son's wife walk all over her. There was only one way out of this, a way to regain the control she had lost. "Time to put my plan into action," Sandra whispered to herself, already scheming her next steps. She wasn't going to be driven out without a fight. Sandra couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment when she realized how infatuated her son had become with Jessica. He had always been somewhat naive, but it seemed like he had truly fallen for her. After their engagement, Sandra had hoped that maybe things would change, that Jessica would grow into the role of a partner. But after the wedding, things took a turn she hadn't expected. Her son insisted on them living together, wanting to ensure she wouldn't be alone. Initially, Sandra thought Jessica would oppose the idea of living with her, but to Sandra's surprise, Jessica seemed completely on board. It wasn't long before Sandra understood why. Jessica, who had once held a job, was now a full-time housewife, and yet the household chores were all left to Sandra. The meals, the cleaning, the laundry, every task seemed to fall onto Sandra's shoulders. Ironically, she still had work to do, even though it was mostly remote. But Jessica didn't seem to understand that. Instead, she took every opportunity to belittle Sandra's efforts, implying that she was doing nothing. Sandra had tried to be patient. She thought that perhaps Jessica just needed time to adjust. But when she asked for help one afternoon, she was met with a response that left her speechless. "Jessica, you seem to have quite a bit of free time. Would you mind helping with the cleaning?" Sandra asked, hoping for a simple favor. To her shock, Jessica turned to her with a face full of disgust. She sighed, as though Sandra had just asked the most absurd thing in the world. "The reason I don't do housework is for your sake, Mother," Jessica replied, rolling her eyes. "Why can't you understand? It's sad that you can't appreciate my thoughtfulness." Sandra blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Jessica continued, explaining that if she did the housework, it would take away Sandra's only job and make her sedentary, which could lead to health issues, even dementia. Sandra's frustration grew, but she tried to keep her composure. "Are you saying that by doing the chores, I'm somehow helping myself?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Jessica, with an air of superiority, nodded. "Exactly. It's for your own good. I'm making sure you don't slack off and become unhealthy." Sandra couldn't believe it. Every day, she was forced to do the chores while Jessica did nothing but watch TV shows. The audacity of it all almost gave her a headache. Sandra's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. She had never envisioned her later years like this, being controlled, belittled, and left to do everything on her own while Jessica sat idly by. She couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of regret. Every day, she thought about the life she had left behind, the one where she could have lived peacefully on her own, without having to deal with Jessica's passive-aggressive behavior and ridiculous theories. The housework had become unbearable, and the emotional toll it was taking on her was worse than the physical strain. But as much as Sandra wanted to voice her feelings, she had always kept quiet, too afraid to rock the boat. Until now. "I can't do this anymore," Sandra whispered to herself. The decision had been made. She had to talk to her son. Sandra had been living in the family home for years, but the physical strain of aging had started to catch up with her. The house was old, with uneven floors and stairs that were difficult to navigate. After injuring her back the previous year, Sandra realized it wasn't the best place for her anymore. She sat down with her son and explained her concerns, the struggles she was facing living in a house with so many issues. Sandra needed to be independent, and her son reluctantly agreed. After much thought, Sandra moved to a new apartment. It wasn't perfect. It felt a bit large for one person, but Sandra had designed it with her taste and needs in mind, even leaving space for her grandchildren to visit. She finally felt like she had her own little sanctuary, a place to call her own. But her joy was short-lived. To Sandra's growing irritation, Jessica began showing up every day, staying for hours, often until nightfall. "Isn't this apartment a bit too big for you, Mother?" Jessica lounged on the couch in the living room, her voice dripping with an unwelcome sense of judgment. "Come on, Mother. Why not come back to the old house? You can do the housework. It's good for your health and longevity," Jessica continued, as though it were a casual request. Sandra couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jessica, who had never lifted a finger at the old house, was now lecturing her about staying active by doing chores. "No, Jessica. I've already moved out. You need to step up as the wife. I take care of the chores here, and my checkups are always good." "There's nothing for you to worry about," Sandra said firmly. But Jessica just turned her head away, pretending not to hear her. It was the same old tactic, ignore anything that didn't fit into her narrative. Sandra had hoped that, with her move, the constant intrusion would stop. But it didn't. One day, when Sandra returned after a rare business-related outing, she was stunned to find Jessica lounging in her living room. "Welcome back," Jessica said, lying flat on the floor, completely unbothered by Sandra's arrival. She didn't even bother to stand up. "Jessica," Sandra said, trying to stay calm, "that spare key is for emergencies, not for you to let yourself in when I'm not home." Sandra felt uncomfortable knowing that Jessica had been in her apartment without her permission. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was disrespect. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I really don't like this. You can't just come into my apartment whenever you want." Jessica was caught off guard. Sandra was usually quick to forget any frustration, but today was different. "You really are a stingy mother-in-law. I can't stand that about you," Jessica yelled, her voice filled with contempt. "I can't stand anything about you, even this apartment. We're family, so you should leave." Sandra was stunned. Jessica was angry because she was living in a space that Jessica thought should be for them. "This apartment is being paid for by James, isn't it? It wouldn't be strange for us, his family, to live here," Jessica continued. "This is living beyond your means." It became clear to Sandra why Jessica had been coming over so often. She assumed that her son was paying for the rent, and now she believed she had some sort of claim to the apartment. In Jessica's mind, the apartment had always been a place for her family. She assumed it was only a matter of time before Sandra would let go of her independence and allow them to take over. But Sandra wasn't going to let that happen so easily. "All right, I'll leave," Sandra said, her voice steady, eyes locked with Jessica's.
She wasn't going to back down this time.
"I'll move out within 3 days." Jessica, ever skeptical and controlling, demanded that Sandra call a moving company right in front of her. Sandra, unfazed, quickly called the movers and scheduled the move for 2 days later. As Jessica walked away, Sandra's mind was already working overtime, formulating a plan that would turn the tables on her daughter-in-law. Sandra moved out of the apartment as promised, but she wasn't done yet. Her new home was an apartment specifically designed for seniors, a place where she could live independently and comfortably. She decided to try it out for 2 weeks before making a final decision. Before leaving, Sandra handed over the keys and lease documents to Jessica, asking her to make changes to the contract through the real estate agent. Sandra had known the landlord for a long time, and they were flexible enough to accommodate the change, which was a huge relief for Sandra. She was already ahead of the game. Meanwhile, Sandra's eldest son was furious when he learned that Jessica had kicked his mother out. He seemed to be contemplating divorce, but Jessica didn't seem to care in the slightest. In fact, she had already started living alone in Sandra's apartment, as though it was her new home. "Well, then let's live separately," Jessica had declared. Sandra could only marvel at her audacity, but she knew the truth was coming soon. Jessica would soon learn the consequences of her actions. Sandra had barely settled into her new routine when her phone started ringing. It was Jessica, and Sandra had been expecting this. As a precaution, she had set up a recorder on her phone to capture the conversation. She pressed the record button and answered the call. "Excuse me, Mother. What's the deal with the rent for this apartment? Why do I have to pay it? This isn't right." Jessica's voice was frantic, as if she had just realized something important. Sandra, as calm as ever, responded deliberately. "Oh, but Jessica, aren't you the current leaseholder?
Isn't it only right that you pay?
Is there a problem?" Jessica's response was immediate and flustered, her voice cracking with panic. "But didn't James used to pay the rent here? We're not even divorced yet. Shouldn't James pay it?" Sandra, trying to irritate Jessica further, kept her tone level and collected. "Oh, Jessica, isn't it time to face the facts? You and James may not be divorced yet, but the truth is, James never paid the rent here. In fact, I was the one financially assisting him all along." At that moment, Sandra's eldest son, when hearing about the rent issue, confirmed Sandra's side of the story. He told Jessica, "I know the truth. You should call my mother about it." The truth hit Jessica hard. Sandra had been the one supporting her son all these years, long after retiring from her job. Sandra had stayed on as a consultant at her old company, and in addition to that, she had been advising in the industry, earning a respectable salary. Jessica had never known the full story, and now, the truth was coming to light. Sandra wasn't just some helpless widow. She was a successful, independent woman who had been quietly supporting her family all along. With my proven track record, I had earned far more than my eldest son. What Jessica didn't know was that I had been quietly helping him out, especially as he struggled with the mounting pressures of his marriage and Jessica's extravagant spending habits. "It's a misunderstanding on your part, Jessica," I said, as calmly as possible. "I was the one paying the rent for that place. I didn't make James pay a dime." Jessica, who had been hoping to live comfortably and independently in the new apartment, seemed utterly stunned. She didn't know what to say. Her only response was a terse goodbye, and she hung up the phone. Immediately, I contacted my eldest son and played him the recorded conversation. I had been putting up with Jessica's antics for far too long, and I could feel my patience running thin. "I'm at my limit too," I told him, my voice steady. "You've been worn out by the debt and her spending. No matter how old you are as a parent, I can't just stand by and watch." My son responded quietly, almost defeated. "I'll divorce her. I'm tired too." That was all I needed to hear. I had a plan and I intended to see it through. I knew I had to move carefully now. I instructed my son to take paid leave for 3 days and begin the process of moving his important belongings out of the house without Jessica noticing. She would be watching him closely, so I told him to work at night in silence and make sure she didn't see any large moving trucks. The destination for his belongings was a single-family home I had secretly arranged for him. This would be his final dwelling, a fresh start away from the chaos Jessica had caused. For 3 days, everything went according to plan. I was ready for the next stage, and Jessica had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, I got the call I had been waiting for. Jessica's voice was frazzled, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The destination for his belongings was a single-family home I had secretly arranged for him. This would be his final dwelling, a fresh start away from the chaos Jessica had caused. For 3 days, everything went according to plan. I was ready for the next stage, and Jessica had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, I got the call I had been waiting for. Jessica's voice was frazzled, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Mother, our house is up for sale. I just got a call from my parents, and they said my belongings are at their house." "What does that mean?" Jessica's panic was palpable. Apparently, my eldest son moved everything out. He sent my belongings to his parents' house and put our house up for sale. "The landlord told me if I can't pay the rent, I should leave," Jessica rambled. "I thought I should consult with James, but when I got home, there were chains and a padlock on the gate. There's even a for sale sign." I could hear the hysteria in her voice, but I remained calm. "Jessica, there are a few things I want to correct," I began, my voice steady and controlled. Now was the time to release all the stress I had been holding in for so long. "First of all," I continued, "I'm no longer your mother-in-law, am I?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Jessica didn't know how to respond. I had finally broken free from the role she had so carelessly forced me into, and now she was left with the consequences. "Jessica," I said softly, "this is over. You've made your bed, and now you'll have to lie in it." She was no longer in control. The house, the apartment, her lavish lifestyle, none of it belonged to her anymore. And there was nothing she could do to undo the damage. As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was free. I was no longer a victim of Jessica's manipulation. My son, though hurt, would eventually come to understand that I had done what was necessary. I had taken charge of my own life once again. The moment of truth had arrived. "Yesterday, James should have filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady, knowing that Jessica could no longer use her usual tactics to manipulate him. "You signed it, didn't you? You and I are strangers now." I knew the divorce papers had already been submitted to the city office by my eldest son. It seemed he had finally had enough. In the past, Jessica had always threatened divorce when she didn't get her way, using it as a tool to control him. But this time, she had overplayed her hand. My eldest son had once thought that one day Jessica would change. He had married her because he loved her, but it became clear that she had no intention of changing. Now, he was standing up for himself. He had signed the papers that had always been used as a threat, and submitted them. The divorce had been finalized. "You always said to James that you could divorce anytime. Aren't you satisfied now that things have gone your way, Jessica?" I said, almost in a whisper, watching her squirm. I could hear her holding her breath on the other end of the line. She wanted to retort, but she couldn't find the words. She had no control anymore. With a calmness that I knew would infuriate her, I continued, "I'm worried about you, Jessica. After the divorce, you can't continue to live in that apartment without working, can you? And moving costs money too. How did you even manage to pay for all of this?" Her anger finally boiled over. "I married James for his inheritance," she screamed. "But I can't touch a single penny of it. Nothing ever goes my way." I was unfazed by her outburst, knowing full well the truth of her manipulations. But this was exactly why I had recorded the conversation. If there were ever a divorce settlement, I had this to use as evidence. Jessica ranted for a good 15 minutes, cursing me and my son, blaming everyone but herself. I let her speak. There was no point in interrupting. The more she raged, the more it would work in my favor. Then something unexpected happened. Her tone shifted. "I'm sorry.
I've been disowned by my family.
I have nowhere to return. Please help me," she pleaded, her voice shaky and desperate. I could sense the weight of her situation. Her parents had finally had enough of her behavior and cut her off completely. It was almost sad, but at the same time, it felt like a natural consequence of her actions. "Apologizing now won't change anything," I said, my voice unwavering. "We're strangers now. There's nothing more to discuss. Good luck with your life from here on out." I ended the call, a sense of relief washing over me. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The fallout from my conversation with Jessica was swift. She had clearly not expected me to be so resolute. After our call, Jessica apparently caused a scene at my eldest son's workplace, and the situation escalated quickly. My son was forced to call the police to deal with her disruptive behavior. Meanwhile, Jessica had been squatting in the apartment that was no longer hers, not paying rent, and now, with no other options, she found herself locked out. The landlord, who had already dealt with enough of her antics, had changed the locks while she was out. She couldn't even get back into the apartment she had once called home. To ensure she couldn't reach us, my son and I canceled our cell phones and switched to new ones. We didn't tell her our new numbers or our new address. She would have no way of contacting us. When Jessica finally turned to her disowned family, she was met with a harsh reality. Her luggage, which I had sent to her parents' house, was left out in the rain in their backyard. I can only imagine the despair she felt as she stood there, realizing that her manipulations had alienated everyone, including her own family. She had nowhere to turn. As I sat in my new apartment, reflecting on the events that had transpired, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. My son and I were free from Jessica's grip, and the weight of her manipulation was finally gone. I knew that this would be a hard lesson for my son, but in time, he would understand. He was a good person, and he deserved to be free from the toxic hold Jessica had over him. For now, I was content. I had reclaimed my life, and Jessica, well, she would have to face the consequences of her own actions. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another for all of us. Jessica's life continued to spiral downward after the eviction. It wasn't just that she had lost her home. Her reputation and her ability to manipulate others had crumbled. Word spread that she was no longer allowed inside the house that had once been hers. The rent, which she hadn't paid for months, had been transferred to her parents, further fueling their anger. I heard rumors from a friend that Jessica was now staying in an apartment rented by a homeless support organization. She no longer had access to the extravagant lifestyle she had once taken for granted. With no more money to spend and no one left to exploit, she was struggling to get by. I remember passing her on the street one day. She looked so different, almost unrecognizable. Her hair had turned shockingly white, and her skin looked dry and lifeless. The change was so dramatic that it took me a moment to realize it was her. The woman who had once flaunted her beauty and power had been reduced to someone who seemed to have aged years in a short period. It made me realize just how much living conditions can impact a person. Her once privileged life had vanished, and with it, so had the life she had so carelessly taken for granted. As for me, I had started a new chapter. I purchased a house using my late husband's inheritance, a duplex that I had carefully chosen so my son could remarry when he was ready. This house symbolized a fresh start, and I felt a sense of peace in every corner. My son still joined me for dinner most nights, but he had his own life to live, and I respected that. The distance between us felt just right. I had learned that sometimes giving space allows for a healthier relationship. The money from the sale of my parents' house was carefully saved for future needs. I knew it would go to my son and his future wife when they married. I also set aside some for any future grandchildren. It felt good to plan for the future again, after so many years of focusing on the past. I had also begun the process of creating the English garden I had always dreamed of. On days when I wasn't working, I would spend hours in the garden, nurturing the young trees and herbs. There was something so calming and rewarding about watching the plants grow, a metaphor for my own life. This new life was filled with hope, and it had become my daily routine. I no longer felt burdened by the past or by people who had taken advantage of me. Now, I could breathe easier, and I had the freedom to embrace the future, whatever it may bring.